Thanks for joining our Twitter space on redistricting in 2022, looking back and looking ahead. Thank you all for your passion for election reform and the need to strengthen our democracy and ensure that every vote counts. I'm Matt, the social media associate at FairVote. We're nearing the end of the map-making process for 2021 redistricting cycle. The litigation part of the cycle is well underway and seems likely to continue for some time. And there was big news this week from New York and Kansas that I'm sure we'll get to quickly. But as nearly every state has enacted the congressional and state legislative maps that will be used in this fall's midterms, here we're looking at Ohio and New York with a fierce scowl. It seems a good moment to look back on how this process went nationwide, to examine the state of play moving forward, to consider the legal questions that remain, and begin thinking about how we might do better next time. I'll pose first questions to everyone, but also wanted to invite you to be part of this discussion, and we'll have time for a Q&A at the end. If you have a question you'd like to ask, it needs to be cleared by Elon Musk personally. Actually, that's not yet the case, so there should be a request icon at the bottom during the Q&A so we can promote you to speak. So first, let me introduce our guests. Cathay Feng is Common Cause's National Redistricting Director. Feng has led Common Cause's work to create or to challenge partisan and incumbent gerrymandering through litigation, state-based organizing around ballot initiatives and legislation, and creating new platforms for community-based redistricting. As executive director of California Common Cause, she championed and won election and redistricting reforms, stronger government sunshine and accountability laws, campaign finance reforms, stronger net neutrality laws, and the voting rights of traditionally disenfranchised communities. She is the architect of California's Citizens Redistricting Commission, leading the multi-year effort to study, write, and pass the two initiatives, Proposition 11 and 20, that created the commission and new community-focused programs. She also led efforts to secure passage of California laws bringing online voter registration and same-day registration to the state. Colby Ickowitz is a national political reporter for the Washington Post, currently focused on redistricting and the 2022 midterms. Colby's career began at the Post in March 2014 as a writer of the storied In the Loop column, which for decades covered the quirks and characters of official Washington. Since then, Colby has covered political breaking news, campaigns, and health policy. She took a brief respite from politics in 2016 to run the Inspired Life blog, focusing on people and ideas that exhibited the best of humanity. Prior to the Post, Colby was the Washington correspondent for the Allentown Morning Call and the Capitol Hill reporter for Congressional Quarterly. She's from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and currently lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband and 4-year-old daughter. Walter Olsen is Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute's Robert A. Levy Center for Constitutional Studies. He's written 4 books about American law, as well as countless articles which have earned him more than 400 broadcast appearances from PBS to Oprah. He is often interviewed as a commentator on election law and was named by Governor Larry Hogan as national chair of a series of commissions aimed at ending gerrymandering in Maryland. Most recently, he has been working with members of Congress who are helping rewrite the Electoral Count Act to provide more certainty in the outcome of presidential elections. Let's begin with a round of quick, short questions and answers. I'd love to give each of you, have each of you give me your 280 character top line or takeaway for what best defines this redistricting cycle for you. So, Kathy, if you would like to begin.
That is a cruel assignment because I have a hard time reducing my thoughts to 280 characters, but here goes. In 2021, 2022, American politicians gave Putin a run for his money as they push redistricting totalitarianism to rig election lines that solidified their partisan, racial, and personal control over elections. It's time to hashtag end gerrymandering with hashtag fair maps for we the people. No period because I can't afford it.
Great. Colby, do you want to go next?
Sure, and thanks so much for having me. I hope there's not too much background noise where I am. But my quick takeaway, the rapid population growth among racial minorities is not reflected in any of the maps except for California. There will be less competition, more baked-in partisanship. When you look at the 2020 presidential results, there will be 18 less toss-up seats and 12 more seats that Trump won by 15 or more percentage points.
All right. Thank you both for those answers. We'll circle back to Walter and Dave if when that gets worked out. So in the meantime, I'll ask my next question to Kathy. So multiple states took the power to draw maps away from lawmakers this cycle and set up various forms of independent commissions. New York and Ohio were among those, and those maps are still being contested. But Michigan, Colorado, and Virginia all look to be in good shape. How did the independent commissions fare overall this year?
Yeah, so first, I think it's important to make a distinction because I think there are some states that have adopted things that are called commissions in name only, but in fact are actually just a collection of politicians. And I am excluding them. So I'm looking at you, Ohio. I'm looking at a bunch of places that created something that is not exactly a commission. And there are a bunch of other states that had true citizen commissions, but they were advisory only. So after the advisory commissions came out with maps, so like New Mexico, New York, Utah, the state legislature said, thank you very much, and then put those maps in the shredder. So I'm not talking about those. I'm only talking about those that are truly independent, where there are a group of citizens who are not directly tied to politicians, but did have very open and transparent processes to hear from people around their state of what the line should look like. And those, it's a small group of states, 3 to 10, depending on how you count them. California and Michigan at the front of the pack, along with Colorado, possibly, depending on how you count it, Arizona, Washington, Idaho, Montana. So those states, I would say, the more independent ones, California had over 100 hearings around the state, had a very open and transparent process. When people didn't like the draft maps, they were able to come forward in hearings and through thousands and thousands of hours of and pages of testimony. The commission corrected course, drew the lines, to be responsive to those public hearings, and in the end adopted by a unanimous vote of Democrats, Republicans, and independents a set of maps for Congress and the states, which then, over the period of 30 days, people could have challenged in litigation, and no challenges were brought forward. So it tells you that an independent citizen commission can work. Now, Michigan is on its first round doing this, so I think that they had a few more bumps in the road. Some of their maps went unchallenged. Some of their maps are still under litigation challenge, and there's a lot to be sorted out. But for the first time, Michigan voters got to see what it was like to be able to participate in public hearings, talk about where their communities were, and have maps where a group of citizens attempted to be responsive. I might give them maybe a B plus, right? For effort and perhaps still some things that need to be worked out. Colorado, a similar situation. So for the most part, those states that have adopted independent redistricting commissions have seen much more success than the ones where partisan politicians have essentially railroaded a process to push through things that will benefit themselves and manipulate them to be able to hold power for 10 years.
Yeah, even in my own state of New Jersey, I think it's very clear that not all commissions are created equal, and the ones with more like independent member selection processes and things do tend to get better results. So Colby, a lot of your coverage this cycle has come through the lens of minority representation. There's been growth among Latino, Asian, and Black voters who provided almost all of the population growth in the last census. Did that equate to additional representation in Alabama, Florida, Texas, Georgia, and other states?
You're right. A through line of my reporting for this whole process has been race, and that began last fall with Texas, which was the most egregious example. This is a state that grew by 4 million people, half of which were Latinos, and neither of the state's 2 new seats that were due to that population growth gave Latinos a chance to elect a candidate of their choice. Now there's a court case that the Department of Justice is involved, and we'll see where that goes. But we've seen racial minorities marginalized. It's a term, cracked and packed, meaning they're either diluted amongst other whiter districts or they're all packed into one district. Either way, it diminishes their voting power. We're seeing this in states big and small. In Ohio, which has been in its own right one of the wildest rides this year, the state Republicans continued to divvy up Democratic, heavily black Hamilton County, which is where Cincinnati is, to ensure it would be represented by two white Republicans, as it has been for the last decade. Just now in Florida, we saw Governor DeSantis get his way and effectively delete a Democratic district along the northern border that was drawn intentionally to give black voters from Jacksonville to Tallahassee representation. And then in other southern states, like Alabama, the GOP legislature continued to pack black voters into one district and disperse the rest of them among conservative white districts. Alabama, for example, is more than a quarter black, but it only has representation in one of the state's 7 congressional districts. Now, a fight over that is going to be the Marquee Voting Rights Act case before the Supreme Court in the fall over whether the Voting Rights Act, specifically Section 2, requires Alabama to draw a second black district because of its population size. A lower federal court had said yes, they had to draw a second one, but the Supreme Court came in and said, too close to the election to rule on that. We're going to talk about it in the fall. So for now, the Alabama map that is going to be the map that they vote on in 2022 is going to be the one that only has the one packed black congressional district out of 7.
Yeah, so speaking of that Alabama quick case, one of the issues we've seen in there is a question about something called independent state legislative doctrine and whether the high court could determine that redistricting issues are the sole purview of the legislature. You've gotten to written about that topic, so can you walk us through that issue?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this was once a really fringe legal theory, and it's based off of a line in the Constitution that says elections are effectively controlled by legislatures. Now, legislatures has been broadly defined as the state legislatures, not specifically the actual, House and Senate legislatures in the state. But this theory has taken on, it's gotten some mainstream attention among Republicans who see it as a way to wrest back control over the maps that they've lost over the past decade. Democrats, who were completely steamrolled in 2011, were successful over the last several years getting governors elected in places like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, getting favorable judges elected in places like North Carolina and Ohio, and that it allowed them to kind of buffer or blunt the gerrymandered Republican state legislatures and their desire to continue drawing lines in their benefit. So what the Republicans are saying now is even if a governor tries to block a map, even if a state court says that it's unconstitutional, it could even lead into commission. Even if there's an independent commission that draws a map one way, it's the state legislature that should have ultimate final say over everything related to elections, including the drawing of district lines. And this would have quite the chilling effect. I mean, it could lead into all kinds of issues around states' rights and how much power the state legislature has in a system that's supposed to be have checks and balances. It would basically erase the checks and balances in state government. So we have some of the Supreme Court justices that have kind of flirted with the idea, seem to think that it has some merit, and it could really come down to Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett. We're not sure where she falls on this question, and the future of democracy might actually rest on the shoulders of Amy Coney Barrett.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how that case ends up. So, Kathy, state courts in New York, Ohio, Maryland, Kansas, North Carolina, and elsewhere have stood up to partisan gerrymanders this cycle. How would you evaluate the job that state courts have done? Are they a sufficient bulwark? And what about the threats that Colby just discussed?
Yeah. I would say that state courts in many states have done us proud. New York, North Carolina, Maryland, Ohio gets 5 gold stars. Pennsylvania, all of these are places where the state courts looked at the gerrymanders that were drawn by politicians and or politicians in the guise of a commission, and said, no, these violate our state constitution, or they violate the federal constitution. I'll just use Ohio as my 5-star example. The legislature sent 4 of its leaders to a commission along with the statewide electeds. They essentially, the Republicans who had a supermajority of that commission iced out the 2 Democrats. They had some fake hearings and then kept popping out maps that were essentially drawn by partisan actors behind closed doors without a open discussion with their colleagues. So what happens? It's challenged. It goes to the court, not once, not twice, not 3 times, but it's been struck down at the congressional level 4 times. They're now on their 5th map. It's been struck down in the state courts, again, 3 times. And each time the state courts have been very clear about the reasons why. And I think here's what's also significant. In many of these states, the judges are people who have been appointed by both Democratic entities and Republican entities, right? So sometimes Democratic or Republican governors, sometimes, by a president. And in the Ohio court situation, this is a court where the Chief Justice was appointed by a Republican, and she unequivocally said this process, has been made essentially a mockery of, and the violation of the Constitution is still apparent. And each time she instructs the commission to go back and redraw the lines, the politicians keep coming back with essentially the same set of maps, but with 1 or 2 precincts that have been moved. So there's a showdown. Now, where does that showdown end up? In some places, like North Carolina and Pennsylvania, the court said, go redraw it. Otherwise, we're going to redraw it for you. And they have. And because it got so close to the elections, when it went up to a Court of Appeals or all the way up to the Supreme Court said, okay, too close to the elections, we're not going to touch it. So those better maps that have been redrawn by the court or selected by the court essentially go into place for 2022's elections. There are other places where the opposite outcome has happened, where bad maps were put in place, and because of lack of time, the Supreme Court essentially knocked those out. And examples of that include Alabama, right? Wisconsin is an open question whether that will be ultimately redrawn. I think that the other big fight that Colby has outlined is that there are some state legislators that are itching to challenge the ability for courts to take any kind of corrective action. They've already stripped the Voting Rights Act of the proactive protections that used to exist under Section 4 and Section 5. So in other words, before you get to a place where the fire has been started by the arsonist, I see the matches, right? I see the fuel. I see the kindling. I see that the arsonist is dressed up in fire protective gear, so I'm going to stop them, right? Now you have to wait for the fire to happen. And the question is whether the Supreme Court is going to say that the state courts or lower courts, any courts, have any ability to be able to take that corrective action and stop the bad map from happening and replace it with a better map, or if they're going to have to go down the road of Ohio, which is forever identifying that a bad map has happened, but not being able to replace it with a better map. And so kind of in this endless cycle until elections are upon them and suddenly the legislature has won the game because they've been able to run out the clock and continue to use the gerrymandered maps that the legislature always wanted. So our challenge, and this is under this crackpot theory, I'll call it, the independent state legislature theory, which I will call the insurgent state legislature theory. They basically want to take all power from the state courts and give it 100% to state legislatures with no ability for the state courts to take corrective action. That is something that some state legislatures are actively pushing. I'll say it's aligned with certain partisan interests that are looking to do that power grab because they see the direction that demographics are going, and maybe this is their Hail Mary to hold on to power. But it's a scary move because, quite honestly, what it will end up doing is saying that in all sorts of areas, not just in redistricting, when you need to take corrective action, that they would try to strip the courts from having the power to take any of that. Real problem. And it's something that we have to look at really, really closely because it may be an issue that goes before the Supreme Court this upcoming term.
Yeah. So taking a step back a little bit, what in both of your minds, we can maybe start with Colby and then go to Kathy. What is it that makes a good map? What are the key criteria and standards that should be used? And how should the drawing process look different from what states typically do legislatively?
Yeah, I mean, it's not really for me to say what makes necessarily a good map, but I think taking politicians out of the process has shown to be the fairest way to draw these maps, taking into account population growth among racial minorities, not drawing lines in a way to ensure that no matter how the population shifts over the next decade, it won't impact your incumbents' reelection chances. Ohio, again, is over the last 10 years, the way they've drawn their congressional map, not a single seat has flipped in a decade. That includes in 2012 when Obama won the state. So you know that the lines are drawn in such a way to benefit the incumbents if you don't see a single seat flip. One can argue whether or not competition should be a benchmark or not. But the fact that in many cases, because of the way the lines are drawn, candidates do not really have to answer to the voters because their districts are so baked in, are so safe that no matter what they do, they're likely or they are going to win re-election. And so, maps that force politicians to be more accountable to their voters, making it so politicians aren't drawing the lines and picking their own voters. Certainly seems like that would be a fairer way forward.
Yeah. Kathy, do you have anything you would like to add there?
Sure. I'm going to double down on everything that Colby just said. I think the starting point is really thinking about who draws the lines, right? Because I think if you just you just think about human nature, it's very hard if you are in the position of running for an office or holding political office to resist the temptation, if you had that power, to be able to draw yourself a safe seat in which you could exclude all of your challengers, include all of your favorite voters who always vote for you every time, including your grandmother and your favorite donor, right? And excise anybody any community or any person who might come up over time to challenge your power. And that is a recipe, and it's why I started, the top of the hour by saying this is a road to totalitarianism. And I don't mean that lightly. We have to be very, very concerned when politicians have the ability to essentially solidify their power and block people who might challenge that power. Now, who is that who challenges their power? Sometimes that's a partisan challenge, right? A lot of times over the course of American history, that has also been white male politicians worried about challengers coming communities of color or from other people who don't follow their line of thinking. And so it has been used to institutionalize racism, institutionalize gender gap, right? Institutionalize sort of everybody who is marginalized. And I think that then if you think about what we fundamentally need in redistricting to change that power dynamic, one of the things is to say, if the reason why we do redistricting on the face of it is to make sure that districts have an equal number of people. Number one thing that we need to do is to look at where the population change is actually happening. And in state after state in 2021, when we looked at the 2020 census data, it was communities of color that were driving that population growth. So Minnesota is a good example. 100% of the population growth in Minnesota, 450,000 people who were born in or moved to Minnesota, who drove the population growth, kept it from losing a seat in Congress, were people of color. So when you redraw those lines, then you have to think about who is not at the table, who's new to the dance, who needs to be represented. You cannot just pursue a least change policy, which many of these states have. Other examples like Texas and Florida, states that have gained seats in the reapportionment allocation of seats in Congress, have seen that their population growth is driven, again, solidly by population growth from communities of color. And yet, time and time again, what they do is they solidify the incumbency protection of white incumbents, oftentimes who are opposed to those communities of color. And Florida saw it. It's why it's crazy how, even though the population growth and the addition of the seats is from Latino and Black population growth, they're actively trying to dismantle Black seats, and they have basically put a cap on the number of seats that Latino populations can elect candidates of their choice. So there's clearly a racial, a white supremacist agenda, which is scary, and I would say is exactly what we should be fighting against. So if we were to embed that into, state reforms, what that means is population demographic changes should be built into the way that we redraw those lines. We should be elevating and protecting Voting Rights Act protections. We should be having hearings where people who come to speak to the commissions are actually heard. And we should absolutely ban, ex parte and secret discussions about how the line should really look like, because that's fundamentally the tool of those people who are trying to solidify their totalitarian power. So I think what we have right now is a lot of politicians who recognize that this may be their last breath. And so this is their last chance to solidify it for the next 10 years. My hope is that the power of the people starts to dismantle that fundamentally corrupt system. My concern is that the current makeup of the Supreme Court could lean towards trying to entrench that power. We'll see.
And Matt, for the last few minutes, we do have Walter Olsen, who is going to speak through my avatar. We're very excited to have him, so you can bring him in on the next question.
Great. So I do have also a specific sort of question for Walter, which is that since you had a front row seat for this process in Maryland, which is one of the states where politicians largely controlled the process and took advantage, what trends did you see in states where lawmakers drew the maps, like Maryland?
Well, thank you. And of course, Kathy and Colby have covered a lot of this already. I don't know whether the maps will worse this cycle. My metric is kind of shamelessness. It's hard to quantify, but I think it might have set a new record for shamelessness. And we saw in a couple of the examples given where voters thought that they were getting some sort of reform, and the legislators turned right around and trashed the reform or bypassed it, Ohio, New York, and some other places. And in Maryland, we knew we didn't have solid reform. It wound up with kind of a happy ending because of the courts, but I'll get to that in a minute. In Maryland, what we did have was the most controversial map in the country. It had gone up to the Supreme Court 3 times, and the legislature used very secretive, and boy, I appreciate what Kathy was saying about when they're going to do dirt, they do not pay attention to public hearings, and they spring the map at the very last minute. All of that happened in Maryland, and they sprang us a map that they called a least changes map. Now, a lot of you know that terminology of least changes, and I just have a thing or two to say about that, because when you're starting with a map that's already good and that people already view as fair, then yeah, least changes makes some sense. It doesn't move people around between districts unnecessarily. When you're starting with the most controversial map in the country, in some ways the worst gerrymander, then coming out and saying we're doing a least changes map basically means we're going to ignore all of the criticism. We are just going to try to get away with exactly the same thing again. So that's what we faced. And the ending was happy because of that same trend mentioned earlier, where the courts kind of flexed their muscles more in some states. In Maryland, the courts have been very unwilling to correct anything. This time, Judge, again, her background was having been appointed by the Democrats, same people who drew the gerrymander, but she handed down such a strong decision that a compromise quickly resulted with a vastly improved map. I'd say that we on the reform side got probably 80% of what we wanted. It's still political, it still protects incumbents, but compared with the old map, it's just a tremendous improvement.
Yeah, so I also wanted to ask, sort of from an optimistic angle, about the Maryland commission you co-chaired to create a fairer Maryland map. So how did you all do that, and what were the criteria and standards that you relied on?
Well, yeah, just to explain, we were part of what were two competing commissions, the one that the legislature set up, which drew the insider gerrymander, and one that Governor Hogan appointed with equal numbers of Republicans, Independents, and Democrats. And it was interesting because we were prescribed, of course, some affirmative traditional standards for good gerrymandering, but we were also blinded politically. And I think that was vital. We were told not to look at party registration, not to look at political history of voting, not to look at residences of incumbents. And to me, people praised the maps that we came up with. We got A's from the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. The editorial pages praised us. And one of the ironies there was that we were praised for the political balance of our maps, but we couldn't look at politics. So we kind of stumbled into fairness from that point of view. What we were looking at were things like compactness, keeping counties together. And I have to say, ours was a cordial commission. We didn't agree on everything, and the Democrats and Republicans sometimes did split. There was no answer to some questions like what to do with the Eastern Shore. There was no good answer, at least. And so we did have found some things that we had to work through and vote on, and sometimes my position wasn't the one that prevailed. But I think it was a lot easier to find consensus with those rules about compactness and following county lines. If we had been told to achieve political fairness, we might still be there arguing, because it's just intrinsically a much harder thing to resolve between people from many different backgrounds and many different political beliefs. What is fairness? That I don't know. What is compactness? Yeah, we did pretty good on that.
Great. So now I want to look more at where things go from here. And this can be short answers because we would like to save a little time for audience questions. But if you were to look for a crystal ball prediction of the most interesting redistricting story to come, or the thing that needs to be fixed most urgently before the next cycle, what would that be? So let's start with Kathy.
That is a hard question because you're asking kind of where do we start? What I think is that there is a fire in the belly in a number of states that have partial reforms, but where those partial reforms sort of prove to be not real, and certainly unsatisfactory to the people who voted for it. And because in many of those states, those partial reforms were achieved through an initiative process, it's possible for the people to actually change the laws. So in that list, I would say are states like Ohio, New Mexico, New York, maybe I'll throw in New Jersey, Utah, where voters voted or have the ability to vote for a better system, and the things that have been adopted in the past, which have essentially been negotiated by politicians to create a fig leaf of reform were insufficient. And I think because people are now seeing working models of real independent commissions resulting in maps that people are generally satisfied with, that can result in real compromise and conversation between people of different backgrounds and ultimately no litigation. I think a lot of states are talking actively about what that could look like. I will say the second area is a much harder one, which is in those states which do not have an initiative process, and where a lot of times the process of amending their state constitution or state law has to go through the legislature at least once, if not twice. They've got a much harder road. And that'll be states like North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Texas, right? Alabama. Those are all states where you know the reform is needed, but it's not clear what the path would be. And in some of those states, the only path has been through the courts. And so one of the things that we've been talking about is how do we strengthen courts across the board, whether that's in blue states or red states, so that there can be a check on the legislature and we capture what our founders envisioned of checks and balances. I think it's important to point out to the Supreme Court, should we get there, that courts have helped us resolve these issues in as many blue states as they have in red states. And so to the extent that some of our Supreme Court justices might be looking at, the partisan outcomes, it will be important for us to stand with friends in Maryland as much as we stand with friends in Texas, or Florida, to say that we need the courts to stand as a bulwark against gerrymandering.
Walter, would you like to go next?
Sure. Let me throw out kind of a wild card because I think it should get us thinking maybe in a more thoroughgoing direction, which is we've heard so much the last 5 or 10 years about partisan gerrymandering, and that's certainly probably the biggest single part of the problem. Testimony we got in our Maryland commissions was that it's big as a problem, but it's only part of the problem. We kept hearing about gerrymandering that was not across party lines, but within party lines. Gerrymandering that was meant to determine who won a primary, protect an incumbent from primary challenge, or go after some maverick or dissident within the majority party. Now, that's a harder thing for courts to get their hands around. Even the courts that have been willing to do things about partisan gerrymandering, that they logically should also be addressing other types of gerrymandering, such as within a party, but the theories, the tools aren't there. And that's one reason I would encourage us to keep looking for the wider institutional solutions, like taking the whole thing away from the incumbents. If you take it all away from the incumbents, then you solve both problems. If you just put in a little bit of judicial supervision of partisan gerrymandering, you are only going to fix part of the problem.
Great. Colby, do you have an answer to this too?
Yes, thank you so much. And I was going to piggyback on what's been said throughout this call. And it's that it seems that you need, if you're going to do constitutional amendments having to do with redistricting, they're going to have more teeth, because what concerns me is what it says about the rule of law, that voters can overwhelmingly approve an amendment and the intent of that amendment, the clear intent of that amendment, is simply disregarded by the legislature. We saw that happen in Ohio and just now in Florida and in New York. And so voters need to stand up and say that they want fair maps, and by fair maps, they want maps not drawn. They want the politics out of the process, and they want They want to be listened to when they vote for something like that in a ballot initiative. So we'll see how over the next couple election cycles, if voters stand up and demand that. But that's what I'll be looking for.
Thanks. We have just a couple minutes left for audience questions. If you would like to ask something, there is a microphone request button in the bottom left, or at least there should be, to request to speak. Okay, well, since I don't see any requests, I'll just say thank you all so much for joining us and for bearing with us during these technology issues. I'm very sorry that we weren't able to get Dave's ability to speak working. But I'm grateful for all of you who stuck with us through the initial link stopping to work for reasons that I do not understand. And we're very grateful to all of our panelists for making the time to join us today. We'll post the recording of this Twitter space on our YouTube page as soon as we can, and stay tuned for more Twitter spaces in the coming months. So thank you all for joining us.